Welcome to What Healthy Couples Know That You Don't, a podcast dedicated to helping you create the relationship you truly want.
Welcome to Trust in Love and Life, how to build, keep, and repair it. Today we are keeping it real with Rhoda on the subject of trust. Trust is basic to the infrastructure of every relationship. Trust goes beyond simple honesty. Trust opens the doors to vulnerability and deeper intimacy. Trust means we are able to share our deepest fears, dreams, and our true selves, which leads to stronger connections that stand the test of time. Love means that when we commit ourselves to a partner, that we are going to do the work to be a better person. Trust means you decide to not betray your partner, and you will do the work required to grow yourself up so that you can take responsibility for your part in the problems. Trust is learning not to indulge in self-pity. Instead, have the courage to look at you and see what needs to be improved. Trust is a gradual process of listening to things that are hard to hear and trusting yourself to be honest about what is true and honestly consider what is unfair. Trust is built on taking responsibility for your own dark side and admitting to yourself it's time to improve. I know that for me, in my own therapy, group therapy was so crucial because there were other voices poking at my dark side and helping me to see it. And I think that is such an important moment. It's that inner wince that recognizes you done wrong. Because as they say in AA, it is progress that matters, not perfection. Trust is about not being afraid to disagree. Trust is about figuring out how to have conflict with dignity, not the ugliness of blame. That's so much easier. Trust is the complicated juggling act of balancing two people's wants and needs. Trust improves with learning to do conflict with respect for the differences you don't like. Trust is not one person staying overly generous and catering to the other. Trust is not people-pleasing by swallowing your resentments and pretending things are okay. Trust is built on vocalizing what is important to you instead of building a silent resentment stash to cash in later. Trust is built on the complicatedness of two people learning to accurately understand and see each other, which takes time. Trust is not running a silent negative narrative in your head about how wrong and messed up your partner is. Trust is being curious about a partner's overreaction, wondering what's underneath it or what the story is, instead of shortcutting to quick criticism. Trust means finding empathy for your partner's defense system and pausing to not react, which shuts down the communication pathways. It's crucial to love and trust yourself to have trust with someone else. Trust in yourself begins with knowing and owning both the good and the bad of who you are. Trust in yourself means your actions match your words. There is a humility that I can speak to from experience that grows from honestly recognizing the ugly parts of ourselves, and it helps us to be more kind to others. There is far more research on attachment than trust. A 2020 study, AZ et al., found cell phone snooping led to, quote, results indicate that lack of trust is a significant predictor of romantic relationship problems. That's why my guest is so important today, because there's not enough research. Trust builds brick by brick on each of these moments. It is the glue that holds relationships together over time. Life can throw a lot of suffering your way, and if you have built layers of trust over time with a partner, the pain is so much more bearable and the joy easier to find. So my guest today is one of my top 2 favorites, and he was last on in October 2023. And he is Daryl Stickle, one of the world's leading experts on trust. His interest in trust began with his PhD thesis from Duke University. He has worked with senior executives from a broad range of industries. He recently published his book, Building Trust: Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World. He first became interested in trust working as a research analyst in British Columbia who had to answer, how do we convince a group of indigenous people we've mistreated for the last 100 years to trust us? So, thank you so much for coming back, Daryl.
Oh, how could I refuse?
Your definition of trust is a willingness, choice, to make yourself vulnerable in the face of uncertainty when you can't completely predict what will happen. Please share with my audience more about what this means so we're all on the same page, because I think it's really important.
Yeah, so it's one of the challenges we often face is the lack of awareness about what trust is and how it works. And we all have this feeling about what it is, but we struggle to articulate it. And so trust is that, that willingness to be vulnerable. And when we use that word, people kind of flinch or they think big gestures, right?
Yes.
And trust is not a dichotomous variable. It's not I either trust you or I don't. I trust some people more than others. And we can tell how much I trust you by how vulnerable I'm willing to be with you. And so a lot of times when I ask people, who do you trust, they go to these sort of deep, close personal relationships, like siblings or spouse or parents. And when I flip the question and I say, who trusts you? We get this sort of long pause. And then people say, well, how do I know? How do I know if people trust me? And it's, how can they make themselves vulnerable, and then do they? And so do they ask you for help? Do they share mistakes that they've made? Do they admit that they don't know things? These are all ways that we can make ourselves vulnerable. I had a client I was working with, and he told me this story about his wife. He said, she keeps bringing up this mistake I made years ago. Every time we have a disagreement, she brings it up. And I said, do you think she lays awake at night giving praise to God because you made that mistake so she can use it against you every time you have a disagreement? and he kind of laughed, and then he went, actually, I think she might. and I said, so how does that make you feel with regard to taking risks with that person, admitting you don't know things, admitting you've made mistakes, or trying new things with them? He said, I just don't do that. And trust is me being able to look like a goofball in front of people I care about and knowing that they're not going to think less of me, that they're going to realize that that's part of who I am.
Yes.
And so, we talk a lot about this sort of willingness to be vulnerable. And for me, trust is this combination of uncertainty and vulnerability, right? It's uncertainty times vulnerability gives us a level of perceived risk. And we each have a threshold of risk that we're comfortable with. If we go beyond that threshold, we don't trust. Well, the higher our uncertainty is, the less vulnerability we can tolerate to still fit below that threshold. And as our uncertainty goes down, the range of vulnerability we can tolerate starts to grow. And that's what deep relationships look like. Really compressed levels of uncertainty and a huge range of vulnerability that I can tolerate. And so if I see a deep, trusting relationship, I know that those people are able to share information with each other, they're able to take risks, they're able to take on tasks knowing that they're not going to be able to do it all by themselves, but that they'll have help. And so that starts to give people almost like a formula to think about this fuzzy topic.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's that combination of uncertainty and vulnerability that's really, it gives us a framework to think about, well, why are trust levels so low right now? Well, our uncertainty is bouncing all over the place.
That's right.
And so vulnerability is really hard. And if I'm asking you to trust me, I'm asking you to be just a little bit more vulnerable. And in today's environment, that's a hard ask.
And with all the anxiety that people are struggling with in so many ways, it certainly makes it far more difficult. And even the anxiety from growing up and perhaps having a mentally ill parent or an alcoholic or whatever. And
Right.
so one of the primary people. So there's so many factors and layers that bring us, and then not being able to trust ourselves. We're not going to trust other people.
Yeah, it's really hard.
Yeah.
And partly it's this narrative, right? We interpret the world through stories, and I loved your intro, so rich and full.
Thank you.
And it's sort of brings us into the complexity of this topic.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
And I got to tell you, Rhoda, I've worked really hard to simplify this so that when people see it, they go, oh, of course that's how it works. Right? This feels obvious.
Yeah.
But that sort of anxiety that we're all experiencing,
Yeah.
that sort of mental health struggle, the loneliness epidemic that we hear talked about,
Yes.
it's our struggle to connect. And it's our struggle to allow ourselves to be a little more vulnerable with other people, because the uncertainty is so high.
Yes.
And so a lot of times when I think about the generation that went through COVID, and the change in norms and values that we've had with more remote work, social media leading to us having less interpersonal connection, it feels like the rules have changed, and we're not quite sure what they are yet. They haven't really stabilized for us. And so there's so much uncertainty that we're really struggling with those little bits of vulnerability. It feels catastrophic to share even small pieces of ourselves. So
I was just watching a show, and I do that at lunchtime, and there was a character, and she had been vulnerable with her work colleague, and that person did her in because of ambition. And I thought, and those kinds of messages aren't helping us with taking risks, and because it is about risk taking with uncertainty, and it's so important.
yeah, I mean, we're facing some real challenges, and what I propose is, there's an art to being vulnerable. We don't want to go too far too fast, right? Like, we don't want to be on that first date and saying, "What do you think about kids? I think I'm in love with you," right? Like,
That was a good example.
yeah. And so we want to start small and see if people reciprocate, right? So sharing a bit of information, maybe admitting that you're stuck or struggling with something. Or telling someone you'd like a different perspective, right? So inviting them into the conversation and valuing their input. These are all small steps we can take. And, I did a podcast not too long ago with someone who was focused on conflict. These are all skills we can practice and get better at, right?
Yep.
We can get better at having conflict and having it be part of our relationship that allows us to actually come to understand one another better. And if you and I have a really strong relationship, we're able to disagree with each other and and try to understand each other's perspective and actually get curious rather than judgmental.
I think conflict is such an important quality, and I think many people lack that ability to put into words when you disagree. And a lot of that is about people pleasing and wanting people to like you.
Right.
But there's so much more authenticity when conflict is respectful and able to happen.
Yeah, that ability to say, geez, that's not my perspective, or I have a different, Or what about? And to get curious about why we're triggered about things, right? What is it that's threatening me with that conversation? Or why do I feel out of kilter, right? Or offside? And this is,
that's a good way to put it.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
asking
this
those
is
questions.
particularly important right now, right? I mean, we're seeing such profound divides and a growing list of conversations we can't have.
Yes, that's right.
And so we're just walking on eggshells. And higher trust levels are what we need. And we've taken so much effort to remove conflict from kids' day-to-day lives that they don't get a chance to practice. And then they become emotionally flabby, as a friend of mine says.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, they're just not in good shape, right?
You know, sometimes parents drag their kids in because there's a divorce. The kid hasn't asked for it. And I bring them out and I say, you know, I really think they're pretty solid. I think they maybe even have been expecting this, you know, teenagers especially. And I think that one of the things you have to keep in mind is duality. And they are going to learn more about the complicatedness of the world. And conflict is about complicatedness.
Right.
And being able to disagree is about handling complicatedness. And I think that's what's missing. There aren't enough conversations about how to handle complexity and think in a complex way.
Right. Yeah. So I went through a divorce. And I realized early on that I didn't want to create a difficult environment for my kids. What I was focused on was the relationship with them. And so for me, that meant I shouldn't be bashing my ex in front of them because they still love their mom. And me attacking her made them feel either like they should be defending her or they had to defend her and feel guilty if they didn't. And it was also an attack on part of who they were.
That's right.
And so I was really careful not to say negative things about her. And when they would come to me and say, you know, this is what Mom has said about you, I would say, people interpret the world through stories. And that may be your mom's story. And for her, that may be true. I have a different story. And they'd say, well, what's your story? And I'd tell them my perspective, my perception of things. And I'd say, now you have two stories. And you actually are in a better position than anyone because you're a foot in both worlds to create your own story that includes parts of each of those. And that's back to that complexity that you were talking about.
And it goes also to the complexity of trust, because when you can juggle two stories and appreciate what the different truths in each of those stories, and maybe the pieces that are exaggerated or personalized, and you can put those together, then you're going to begin to really understand the complexity of trust and people and connections, et cetera, et cetera. I could make a list a mile long.
Yeah, and it's served them both well, right?
I bet. Yeah, it's wonderful the way you did that. It is.
Yeah, and so, and it solidified my relationship with them because I was creating a safe harbor for them, and I was thinking about them first, right? And I was creating an environment where, you know, we could disagree about things and it wasn't personal. And one of the tactics I always used was when my kids were having a meltdown and we were having a hard time getting along, I would say, you know, remind myself to say, even in this moment when we're struggling, I love you. And they would say, you know, I hate you or I don't love you or whatever. And I would say, that's okay. It doesn't impact how I feel about you. And you're free to change your mind whenever you want.
It's that 1-10 black, white easier, it's so much easier to just decide that this is right and that is wrong, instead of taking the pieces that are right and wrong and trying to digest them and put them together. And I think avoiding conflict is about comfort, and I think we've gotten so comfortable with taking the easy way out.
Yeah.
And the harder work, even the harder work of self-awareness. You know, how can you trust if you don't have self-awareness and aren't able to say, I screwed up?
Yeah. So this, you know, it brings up an interesting topic, the sort of internal and external locus of control. Right?
Yes.
So
yes.
when I used to teach my undergrads, I'd say to them, internal locus of control means you're master of your own destiny. You make things happen in the world. You're an agent of change. And an external locus of control means things happen to you. You're buffeted by the winds of fate. And I said, how many of you have an internal locus of control? And they're good little capitalists, right? So all the hands go up. And I said, this is fantastic. This means that if you don't do well in my class, it's not my fault. It's not because the test was too hard or I didn't teach it properly. It's all you, baby. And they kind of went, oh. And I said, yeah. So we tend to have an internal locus of control when we're successful and an external locus of control when we fail.
Yes.
And what that does is it prevents us from learning. And so a lot of times what I would do with my sons is I'd say, if you're successful, take a moment and think about what was the situation that led to me being successful. Right? And, you know, for example, I want to have success dating women. Best opportunity for me is if there's alcohol involved and I'm the only man there. Right? So there's a good environment, a good setting. Unless it's a gay bar. And vice versa, if I fail, what was the role that I played? What are the things I could have done differently? How could I have acted to make a change? And it's just that moment of self-awareness to say, what can I learn from my failures? And how can I learn from my successes in a way that allows me to identify situations where I can be successful again?
And it's that shuttling back and forth between the internal and the external. I keep thinking about how important it is, even with our emotions, people tanking because they're really depressed. It's fall, and there's just a lot of crashing and burning in the fall. And so they get very negative and collapsing. And I keep talking about shuttling into more of a balance,
right,
and being able to recognize what are some things I can do to make myself feel better in the fall, for example.
Nice.
So, yeah, I like what you're saying about the internal and the external, because that's a really different way to think about it.
Well, and I think about stories, you know, we interpret the world through stories. I have a relentlessly positive story about my sons. They are the center of my universe. And I love being their dad. And so, you know, through their lives, I have tried to build this positive narrative with them and observe the world and say, hey, I see this. And that's a really good story. You know, my oldest son, we're walking through his elementary school one day, and all these kids were saying hi to him. I said, wow, you're really popular. He said, oh, they're just being polite, Dad. And I said, so they walked by 5 other kids and then said hi to you? And he was like, really? And so you start to adjust that narrative that they have, right? That dismissal of the positive and that focus on the negative. My younger son, you know, he struggled with baseball because he got hit in the face the very first time he played.
Oh, ouch.
And so he was scared of the ball. And
yeah, I would be.
Yeah. And so he's playing and you know, he's at bat, and we're trying to figure out ways to make him more comfortable. So we get him a helmet with a face guard, and And then he's got elbow pads and he's got knee pads. And like there were medieval knights that went into battle with less gear on, right? and the parents are looking at me going, wow, this must be hard for you to watch. He's so scared. And I said, you've got the wrong story. How often do we get to face something we truly fear and have the chance to overcome?
Yes, that's right.
And his last at bat, he got a base hit, and the parents from both sides, both teams, stood and gave him a standing ovation. And I said, you're someone who overcomes. You're someone who achieves in the face of real challenge. That's a great story.
It is. And I think with social media and texting, people text I love you, they text breakups. They don't want to look in the eyes and face the fears of hurting someone. And that's the stuff that's creating a divisive nation. It's the stuff that's creating the loneliness you mentioned earlier, which is so pervasive, and it's a huge problem. And one of the things I really don't want you to miss talking about, my favorite thing, and I don't think I told you this part when we talked about it the last interview, but my favorite psychiatrist, he says that I'm good with difficult people. They trust me. And it wasn't until you shared your definition that knowing trust, the bedrock of trust is knowing the other person has your best interests at heart. And I'd like you to talk about that because for me, it explained to me why people do trust me in the room, in my job, and I really wasn't sure about it before.
Right.
So if you could talk about that.
Yeah, and I think the research suggests that is it over 80% of the impact you have as a therapist is based on the relationship, the quality of the relationship you're able to establish?
I've something like that. I've always felt that people don't understand how important. So I text with people. I sent somebody a funny cartoon, because I knew it was exactly something that they were struggling with, and they were able to laugh, and I thought that was so cool.
Yeah.
But it took me 10 seconds, but I know that they know I really do pay attention.
You're thinking about them.
Yes.
Right? And
Yep.
And so that's powerful. And it's the same thing with the coaching clients that I have. They know I want them to be successful.
Yeah.
And they know that I care. And so, I think there's some recent research that's supposed to be coming out soon that talks about benevolence is probably the most powerful lever. That belief that you've got my best interest at heart, that you're acting in my best interest. And the challenge is, it's one thing for me to believe that. It's another thing for me to have it actually land with you. And so,
that's right.
In our last podcast, you and I were talking, and I mentioned your listeners, and you said you're the first one who's actually mentioned my listeners before me.
That's right. I did, yeah.
And that was me thinking about you and what success looked like for you, and thinking about your listeners and what brought value for them. And so benevolence is one of those things that really important, but sometimes hard to have land. And, I work with parenting groups, and I'll say, who here has their kid's best interest at heart? All the hands go up. And then I flip the question. I say, how many of your kids would say that? It's about a third. And it's somewhat hesitant, right? And so if it's not obvious in a place where it's supposed to be obvious, like how do we make that work when we're partners with someone, or if we're a leader, or, how do we make it work as a parent? Because imagine you and I are sitting at dinner, Rhoda, and one of your listeners comes up and says, oh my God, Rhoda, I love your show. And they see me, I'm about to tuck into this big dessert, and they're like, wow, Daryl, you're not going to really eat that, are you? And their intent is benevolent, right?
Right.
But what they don't realize, Rhoda, is this body doesn't just happen, right? There's years of neglect involved. right? There's bad decisions that have been made, and a relentless passion for failing to exercise. And so,
And so the landing doesn't work. And they don't know it till it happens. They lack imagination. What?
we struggle to have empathy with the other party sometimes. And we struggle to involve them in the conversation, right? Because
Yeah.
I had a student, and I think I tell this story in the book, who, we're sitting in a group, and I said, okay, so tell me a relationship that matters to you, because we were talking about benevolence, we were talking about that notion of best interest, and he said, well, my girlfriend, and I said, okay, and what matters most to her, because benevolence is about helping someone else succeed, thinking about their best interests. How do we show up for that? And so he said, well, I think it's her family. That's the most important thing to her. And I said, okay, so here's what you're going to do. You're going to go home tonight. You're going to talk to your girlfriend. And you're going to tell her that your prof was asking about a relationship that really mattered, and you said her. I said, that's step one. It's telling her that the relationship really matters to me, and I think about it outside of when I'm around you. And I said, and then you're going to say, and he asked me what mattered most to you, and I said family. Is that right? Because now you're giving her a chance to be involved in the conversation, to correct you if you're wrong. And I said, and when she says, yeah, my family's really important to me, you're going to say, concrete follow-up, then I assume it really matters to you that I get along well with your family. And I'm going to start making efforts. I'm going to go for lunches with them. I'm going to call them and connect with them. I'm going to try to strengthen my relationship with your family because it matters to you.
Yes. The complicatedness of that. Yes.
Right? And so there's transparency
Yes.
there. We've had agreement on what the success looks like, what her best interests are. And now we've had a concrete, this is what I'm going to do. And it's not open for interpretation. I have removed all doubt. This is why I'm doing this. The next day he came back to class and he had this huge grin on his face and he said, wow, that went really well.
I bet it did.
Yeah. And he said, my girlfriend says I'm allowed to talk to you whenever I want. So
That is a great story.
yeah, and in our last episode we talked about, the fact that we can have these conversations where we talk about, I think I'm benevolent, but it doesn't always land that way. Have you ever experienced that? Because almost everyone has a story of when they've tried to do something in someone's best interest and it's failed.
Yes.
And we narrow that focus and we say, well, tell me about those experiences. Tell me why it went off the rails. And then we take the next step and we say, has someone ever really had your back? What did that look like? What did they do? How did it feel? Now we're getting hints, right? And then we take it down to that final bottom of the funnel and we say, what does success look like for you? How can I help you get there? What would it look like if I was benevolent to you? And now we've created this opportunity for transparency, right? And I like to leave people with something they can try, something they can practice. And that's what you and I have just done for your listeners, right? And so that's my attempt to be benevolent in the world. And to, yeah.
Yeah, and that, yeah, I really do like that. What are a couple of barriers to trust that we could explore?
Yeah,
Besides lack of self-awareness.
yeah, so that lack of self-awareness is a big one.
Yeah.
And we see, there's incredible value in trust. Everyone agrees. Teams perform better. Relationships are stronger. We're better parents. We're better partners. We're better bosses. We're better neighbors. All of these things get better. Yet trust levels are at the lowest we've ever seen. And so why is that? Well, partly it's this lack of awareness. We don't always recognize a trust problem when we see one. We may just have this feeling of anxiety, this feeling of, oh my God, I'm not comfortable. And we don't always identify that as a trust problem. Even when we do, we may fail to know how to fix it.
That's true.
Right? And so we're not quite sure what to do. Or if we see somebody else struggling, anxious, you know, how do we help them in a way that lands for them, that doesn't make them feel even worse? And so this lack of awareness is a big challenge. 95% of people believe they're more trustworthy than average. And that's not only statistically impossible, it's problematic because if I do see a trust problem, I think it's somebody else's fault.
That's right. Yes, that's exactly what you'd think.
And so I don't have to deal with it. And we see the same thing with leaders. The biggest gap we see is between how much they believe they're trusted and how much they actually are. And so we assume it's somebody else's fault or somebody else's issue to deal with. Some of the other challenges we run into is people feel like, I'm just too busy. I can't actually invest the time and energy in this. And what they don't realize is that a lot of the fires they're fighting are caused by underlying trust problems. And trust acts as a social lubricant, and it would actually make their lives so much simpler. And then we'll get this, it's too complicated. Trust just is what it is. You can't do anything about it. And I know that's not true, right?
No, it isn't.
I've worked with too many clients. You've worked with too many clients where you've seen actual progress made. Things get better. It's something we can be intentional about and something we can work on. And it's a skill that we can all get better at.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last one is the timeline, right? Like trust takes too long. And I have short-term problems that I need to focus on. Trust can happen very quickly. If we're intentional, if we have the right focus. And the reason it's getting harder is because of the spikes in uncertainty, but it's partly that's driven by these virtual teams, by social media, by our lack of personal connection and the limited information we get from each other. You send a text to someone, they don't hear tone. They are interpreting.
But they imagine it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. They got a story in their head they're interpreting, and
it's all caps.
Yeah. And they could get the same message from you and from me. We could have identical text, and they would have a different response.
Yeah. And
so we need to be more intentional than we've ever been about building trust and communicating.
I really love what you said about 95% of the people think they're trustworthy. And that makes sense to me. And therefore, not looking at their part in things and being willing to, recognize we all make mistakes with trust.
Yeah.
There isn't anybody who's mistake-free. We're human beings with self-interest, and we need to tread more carefully sometimes.
Yeah.
And you seem to have a really good imagination about the other person, which is in part empathy, but it's also imagination. What can we do about trying to have, besides
reading
books which tell you stories about characters, which I'm a big reader, so
Yeah.
I think that's where a lot of my empathy has come from. And what else can we do about that lack of imagination about somebody else?
Well, one of the things that I suggest, and you got a chance to read my book, right?
Yes.
And so there's a lot of stories in there, and telling narratives. And partly I have gained so much experience over the last 20 years helping organizations. The thing that kind of sets me apart in some ways is that sort of wrote a doctoral thesis, PhD in business, so deep theoretical understanding of the topic, followed by a lot of really practical applied experience. And so I learned through doing. There's a lot of pattern recognition there. But there's also this attempt to understand what the other person's story might be. And so a lot of times what I'll do is when somebody comes to me and says, I'm really struggling with this person or that person, I'll say to them, one of the questions you might want to ask them is, if you were me, what's the story you'd be telling right now? And, if our roles were reversed, what's the story you'd be telling right now? And it causes them to stop and go, oh, wait a minute. What are the possible stories you could be telling right now? And one of the things...
Well,
Go
let
ahead.
me just say this. It's exactly like I came up with this when couples are having arguments. I ask them to take a piece of paper and write down what's important to them about the argument, but also write down what's important to the other person about the argument.
Right.
And that's the piece that gets the thinking going and the imagination about the other person. And then you exchange, you have a break, but you then exchange papers and talk about and get and course correct what the story is about what's important in the argument.
Yeah.
I tell people to do this all the time, and they rarely do. A couple of people have done it, and I think it's been helpful. But that's why it's about helping with not just it's helping with the trust. Like, do you get where I'm coming from? Do you have enough imagination about me?
So one of the things I've found powerful, Rhoda, is executives in conflict, much like the couples that you're dealing with, they're stuck together, right? There's barriers to them exiting, and they're not getting along. And what I tend to do is I'll sit down with each of them separately and say, tell me the story of how we got here. How did we get here, and what's happened, and where are we now? And so I'll do that with each of them. Then I bring them together, and I'll say, person one, I want you to try to tell me person two's story. And it causes them to think about that story in real time, to try to articulate it, and it gives person two a chance to disagree or to correct misperceptions. And basically what I'm trying to do is go from two separate narratives to one shared narrative. And it's been really successful. At some point I have to say to them, okay, your relationship is relatively resilient. You can stop walking on eggshells now. Because that's not helping, right? But I've seen profound success in being able to get people to try to tell the other person's story while they're sitting there.
Yeah, that makes sense to me a lot.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times I am reinterpreting person one's story so that person two can hear it.
Right.
Because sometimes it's an obstacle, course, if you will.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's that's wonderful. It really is. I really like that. I want to say one more thing. So many of us do suffer with short-term thinking and don't look at long-term consequences.
Yeah.
And I think negotiations are too focused on short-term gains. What can relationship problem solving do to not get caught in this trap?
Yeah.
Because that's something you are good at, is relationship problem solving.
Yeah, and you're right. We have a tendency to have short-term gain for long-term pain, right? We see that with substance abuse and addiction and failure to exercise and fights over where we're going for dinner. And so partly, again, we need to adopt the perspective of the other party and think about what are the implications for this long-term. And I try to promote more long-term thinking, more relational building. So my youngest son is fantastic, but he's fussy, or he's gotten a lot better, but he was really particular about the food that he ate. And a friend of mine wanted to go out for dinner and bring our kids along, and so we went to this Italian restaurant, and I was not sure how it was going to go over, because I'd never been there before. We'd never been. And Alexander, my younger son, took a bite out of his pizza and he said, I don't like it. I said, okay. And so we finished our dinner, and he's upset because in his past experiences, in situations like this, he just goes hungry. Because his mom's approach is, you're going to eat what's there or starve. And I said to my friend, he likes chicken nuggets. Can we drive through McDonald's on the way home? And we get to the McDonald's drive-through, and Alexander says, what are we doing? And I said, we're getting food for you. And he said, I don't understand. And I said, I chose the restaurant. It was my decision where we went for food. It didn't work for you. If I want you to be willing to trust me to choose a restaurant again in the future, I have to make good. And so I have to make sure you don't get punished for my decisions. And that changed the dynamic. After that, he was willing to try things because he knew I wasn't going to punish him for it.
Wow, that is a really good story. And it's evidence. It's evidence that you have his best interests at heart.
Absolutely.
And you're taking responsibility for your choice and your side of the fence. And then he experiences, because I do think experience is our most powerful teacher.
Yeah.
And he experiences this and he opens up.
Yeah.
That is such a great story. Oh my goodness. Okay, I want to ask you something.
Yeah.
I want to know if you will do an episode with me once a year, because already we're at 46 minutes and we covered 2 questions, but I loved the conversation.
Yeah.
But I think I'm serious. I think I would like to do this with you like on a once a year basis. And I only do a new episode like every 2.5 weeks. I'm not a twice a week kind of person. So
I would be delighted, Rhoda.
Oh, I would really enjoy that. Now, before we end and we lose our people's attention, tell them your book and where they can reach you and your website and all that good stuff.
Yeah, so the book is called Building Trust, Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World. And I've been getting great feedback from not just executives, but academics and regular people who talk about, you give me a formula for actually dealing with people problems, connecting with human beings, other human beings. It's written in a way that's very accessible.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and so it's filled with stories and anecdotes and real, like, my intent was to take the entire model and put it in there, along with tips and approaches to actually pulling the levers I talk about. I'm on Instagram under Daryl Stickle, all one word, and it's all lowercase. You can find me on LinkedIn, and my website is trustunlimited.com. And email me at daryl@trustunlimited.com. I'm happy to be helpful.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Trust in relationships is one of the most rewarding and challenging parts of life. So here's to growing and investing in trust. If you're interested in learning more, be sure to check out my website, therapyideas.net, that takes 15 seconds to load, so have patience, because there are over 450 pages of free information with no ads.
Thank you for listening to What Healthy Couples Know That You Don't. If you have enjoyed the show, please leave a rating and review on iTunes and help get the word out. To learn more or connect with Rhoda, visit therapyideas.net.